Welcome to episode 4 of the Resplendent Window Radio Show, where we change the way we look at things so that the things we look at begin to change. That's a quote that you've probably heard before from Dr. Wayne Dyer. That's who I first heard it from, and it's a way of looking at how our perspective on ourselves, our perspective on life, our perspective on the world and on other people, and even our perspective on God can change the way that we experience life and the way that we experience ourselves. And so much of this has to do with what is known as self-concept, or your concept of yourself. And that's a big thing that I talk about here on LinkedIn. It's also, and if you're hearing the recording of this, you're not on LinkedIn, you're probably on YouTube. So make sure that I'm speaking to both audiences at the same time. But I see that Jeff is here with us. Jeff, good to have you with me, buddy. Thank you so much for being a part of the show this time. I'm going to be sharing with you guys today a story that I wrote, I think, in 2022, and it's a different kind of story for me. It's something that really dives into more of the kind of spiritual aspect of things in a very outright way. It's a story called A Place Within, and I know I said in the description for this episode that it's a story that you can read along with me, and it's available at my growth farming website. I was wrong about that. I had intended earlier this year to make it available and publish it there, but I did not have an audio recording for the story yet. And if you've spent any amount of time on my site, you know that I include the audiobook version with the digital ebook version as kind of a package deal together. Because some people I know prefer to listen to a book or listen to a story. It helps them be able to take in that story a lot better, a lot easier. And I enjoy performing the stories that I write, and kind of this, very similar to what we're doing here, old-fashioned radio show style. I like giving each of the characters their own voice and adding some drama to the effects of the story. It makes the reading more fun for me, and it's just a fun experience. I've been a fan of old-fashioned, and I say old-fashioned like 1920s, 1930s radio for a very long time, because that was back before we had television. I say we. I wasn't alive back then. I don't think many of us were, but that was back in an era before television existed, before we could see moving pictures on a screen, and our imaginations weren't having to create everything from scratch. And so much of what I want to share with you guys here, and so much of what this audio room, this radio show is about, is going back into those olden times and remembering what it was like to have to imagine things based on just what we're hearing, or getting a notion about something and then using our imaginations in a very inventive and creative way to visualize within our minds what it is that's taking place. And it's what we do when we read books, isn't it? We're reading words on a page or words on a screen if we're doing it digitally or by Kindle. And either way, there's something that's taking place within our imagination that's allowing us to see into this other world, this world that exists inside our imagination, and we're being, induced into this fantasy world by way of these stories. And so that's what I want to share with you guys this time around. There's a story beneath the story inside this tale called A Place Within. And I'm going to make this story available to you if you do want to read it. All you have to do is send me a message. You can do that through the messenger here on LinkedIn if you're watching the replay or listening to the replay on YouTube. You can send me an email, dgrant@dgrantsmith.com, and say, hey man, I want to read A Place Within, and I'll make the story available to you. If you want to hear or read any of my other stories, I do invite you to go check them out and grab both the digital ebook and the audiobook. They're packaged together. It's a 2-for-1 sort of deal. That's the way I like to share my stories, and all of them are available at growthfarming.com/products. With that, something else about this story that's a little bit different is the story takes place in the early 1920s, and it takes place in England. So I'm going to be doing my best to share this story and all of the characters with British accents. Now you can tell me what you think about my rendition of British accents. I'm going to be doing my best. I've done this story about 2 times previous, but it has been a little while, and I've done a little bit of rehearsal for this. So I'm going to be doing my best to grab the accents and make sure that it's as interesting and engaging as possible. And when I get to the end of the first chapter, we'll see who's in the room, and if you guys want me to read the second chapter of this book, there's 5 chapters and an epilogue. I add an epilogue to the end of all of my stories because it's a way for me as the author to go back and just reflect and encourage you as a reader, or as a listener in this case, to maybe see some things that you didn't see initially in the story, and to explore the story behind the story. You've probably seen or heard me talk about that a whole lot. It's true in fiction. It's true in our regular everyday life. There's always a story beneath the story, if we will have the eyes to see and the ears to hear and go deeper into that. With that, though, I'm going to go ahead and begin this reading of A Place Within, Part 1. It wasn't far from St. James Square, perhaps a few hops, a couple of skips and a little scuffle off of Downing Street. Westminster Abbey, Old Big Ben, and Great Scotland Yard were all neighbors. It made perfect sense to my inventive and spellbound 10-year-old mind that an old building would be a place where mystical wonders would take place, though that's not how my grandfather described it. He was more of a practical man, at least when it came to matters of running his household and the affairs of business and politics. I didn't understand either of those things at the time, but had overheard enough of his conversations with my father to know he seemed drawn to what could be explained or understood at a basic, rudimentary level. If you can't explain to young Douglas here what that contraption is for and how it works, then you don't truly know a lick about it. My grandfather had told some gentleman who came round one afternoon selling some big mechanical contraption that supposedly made the household broom an obsolete relic of a bygone era, or so he claimed. Yet the man seemed a bit confused by its operations and functionality, struggling with great difficulty to make the obese mechanism turn on correctly, let alone perform its intended purpose. After several minutes of failed attempts to make it work, all to my curious intrigue and my grandfather's seeming impatience, the man was dismissed and was asked to leave. He didn't put up much resistance to the request and instead tried to maneuver his monstrous mechanical sucking mop back out through the front door and down to another house to try again. My grandfather just rolled his eyes, took a deep, heaving breath as he shut the front door. I looked up to meet his eyes with a bit of continued curiosity. "What do you think that thing actually did?" I asked my grandfather. "Nothing you nor I couldn't possibly do for ourselves," my grandfather replied. That practicality seemed to be his go-to method for dealing with just about everything, until one day I asked him if he believed in God, or the power of magic, or the mystic wonders. Perhaps by today's standards that may seem like a strange question, maybe even a bit blasphemous to associate a being such as the divine, God, that is generally relegated to a religious application, to something considered by the staunchly religious practitioners to be of the devil, referring, of course, to magic and the mystic arts. But I didn't grow up around religious thinking or beliefs. Miracles and strange wonders seemed to come from some hidden realm outside of our natural world, and yet also existing within it at the same time. In my own imagination, I had tramped through realms and kingdoms that didn't seem to exist in the realm of my senses, yet were so real to me that I couldn't deny their existence. Surely if my mind could see it and touch it, it had to exist somewhere. We had gone for a walk, or midday stroll as my grandfather called it, out to the River Thames and down toward the Park of St. James, when I asked him about his beliefs in the unseen power of God and the world of magic. At first he seemed to dismiss the question and change the subject, but then he stopped dead in his tracks. He looked up at a somewhat dilapidated old building. He seemed transfixed on this place, as if the facade of its rustic, ramshackle front entrance held him in some sort of trance-like spell. "What is it, grandfather?" I asked with a joint mixture of wonderment and also a bit of nervous trepidation. I had never seen my grandfather so spellbound before, though there wasn't a hint of fear or concern in his facial expression. Instead, he looked like a child watching pictures on a movie screen for the first time, totally enraptured by the spectacle of it all. There was nothing about the appearance of this place that made it appealing to the random passers-by, as we were today, and yet, as I paused and turned my gaze from the awestruck face of my grandfather and back to this dented gray brick building in its worn-down outward form, I too felt this strange captivation towards it. We both stood transfixed for a long moment before he responded to me. "You know, boy, I never believed in anything that I couldn't see with my own eyes and touch with my own hands, or explain to a boy your age how it worked. I suppose that's what made me a lousy Protestant in my younger days. But," he responded before trailing off for a long moment. "But what, grandfather?" I asked, now swallowed up in mystified curiosity. "But sometimes that magic you spoke of, maybe that's God, I don't know. Sometimes it encounters you when you least expect it, and it changes what you thought you knew to be true," he replied softly. My grandfather was well known for short, brief stories. He rarely answered questions with much detail. Quick and to the point was his way and manner. I expected this short response, just given, to be all that he would say on the matter. But for the first time in my young life, I learned about an experience that would alter the course of history and make me change the way I saw the world that is known and the universe that lives in the unseen realms. Well, that's the end of Chapter 1, and since I am speaking to myself here so far, I will continue to read this story. This is Chapter 2 now of A Place Within. Back before the turn of the century, the dawn of the 1900s, we Brits were still transitioning to a more mechanized way of living. My grandfather began his tale. The horse-drawn cart shared the bustling roadways now with this motorized contraption that was auspicious at first, yet alluring to ride in. If you didn't own a traditional coach, as some people such as myself did not, there was now a way to travel through town during a sopping rainstorm without having to maneuver with an umbrella through a massive crowd of people. Plus, it made the commute to the pub in the evening much more enjoyable. Christopher, one of my old chums, was from my school days, a young lad, had recently moved back to London proper and had taken up building these motorized carts himself. He'd just finished one and picked me up one evening to go meet the lads at St. Quisby's for a pint. I hadn't begun seeing your grandmother yet, and was a bit of an eligible bachelor with a promising career in medicine. So I often treated the lads to a drink or two when we were able to all be together. Louis, the most eccentric of our group, would arrive wearing some flamboyant coat and clothing choices, then jump behind the piano to entertain the whole pub with his virtuosic renditions of our favorite songs after he had a few rounds in him. And rounding out our little band of brothers was Clive, a soft-spoken fellow we'd all known since just before going to university. He was a cobbler by trade, who seemed to spend much of his time reading about the history of the world and scanning the London Times for stories to confirm his growing belief in the soon-to-be end of the world. The news gazettes and papers seemed to talk endlessly about either the marvels of the rising technology or warnings of impending danger. Actually, the papers still do that today, don't they? Well, that was the main subject that Clive seemed to break out of his quiet shell for, and only after he had a few pints in him. My grandfather continued to explain. It sounds like the pub and the pints are the few things that got you all to live it up a little bit, huh, grandfather? I interrupted. Not always, but yes. Now let me carry on with the story. You'll like this one. That night at the pub was unlike the others before it. It seemed Christopher had a bit of more hope and optimism than he had in a long time. His motor car work had encountered a sudden boom in sales, and he was expanding. I was happy for him, yet I did not know how precarious it had been leading up to his sudden success. Louis was also more cheery than usual. He treated us to a first round of drinks. But it was Clive who got me especially curious. Unlike his usual melancholy demeanor and woeful outlook on the world, he was all smiles and strangely cheery. As we finished off our first pints, the three of them began talking about the series of most surprising and unusual experiences they had. Christopher went from near bankruptcy to an almost overnight turnaround in business. Louis was now just a seamster and haberdasher, but also designing costumes for one of the most celebrated directors in theater. And he'd finally won the love of his life's heart after pining over her for years. They were now engaged to be married, and Clive, who had just lost the use of a foot after an accident in his shop causing him to hobble and limp at a slow pace, was spry in his step this evening, almost dancing from the bar to the table, springing up for a round of billiards, and moving with a graceful swiftness I had not seen in years. What strange occurrences have befallen you lot? I asked them after our third round of billiards, with Christopher and Louis taking the best 2 of 3 games. These two were amicable with each other, but never participated in festivities on the same team. Ah, come on, old boy. What are you on about? Don't like losing with that doctorate status on you now, Louis scoffed. That's not what I'm talking about at all. You two are acting like grand old pals, like the closest of friends, long-lost brothers even. Is your sister the girl he's now marrying? I asked more directly. They both looked at me quizzically, as if it hadn't occurred to them that what brought either of them together wasn't a shared love for any similar interests or hobbies. Louis had been the son of a longtime patient of mine, and I had taken on to check on him a few times over the past year, and we seemed to get along. He'd grant me tickets to the theater, and I obliged him by inviting him to our Thursday evening at the pub, a weekly meeting for Clive, Christopher, and I. Until tonight, the two had kept their distance from each other, like territorial dogs, protecting some unspecified turf area. You believe in miracles, good doctor? Christopher asked. Birth is as close to what one would call a miracle as I can accept, having witnessed it a few dozen times. Why do you ask? I questioned. All 3 of us, old boy, all 3 of us have experienced the miraculous, and all at about the same time, Clive reported, still in his soft, meek voice. Miracles? Like what? I questioned again, still confused by the strange behaviors of all 3 of them. The creditors were beating down my door. I was going to lose more than just the business. The house was going to be seized. My wife was packing us up to move to her parents in the northern countryside. They wanted her to leave me behind and escape the perpetual financial woes we'd barely survived since we got married. I was going to lose everything that meant anything to me and everything that mattered to me, Christopher decreed. I heard you say it was rough goings, but I didn't know it was that rough. Why didn't you ask for help? I asked. Good doctor, you've ridden your gallant horse to save me enough. I've lost business associates and friends from needing financial help. I wasn't going to risk losing my childhood chum too, Christopher replied. So, what happened? How did things turn around so well? You're driving one of the nicest motor cars in London now. You said Christine has never been happier. What caused the sudden change? I inquired. Bernard, Dr. Russell, the nature of the miraculous is that it's unexplainable by modern reason or rational logic. Those two subjects are your primary language, I'm afraid, Louis quipped. If it can't be explained simply, it's not something real or known. Even advanced science and medicine can be explained in a simplistic manner. Besides, business is pounds and tuppence. Just tell me what happened, I asked, now with a more demanding tone. I felt these lads were avoiding the real subject here. I'm afraid we can't, Bernard. It's part of how this strange thing works, I'm afraid, Clive inserted. If you ever find yourself needing a miracle, I believe we can point you in the right direction, Christopher stated. All right, I see. So, Clive, you can't tell us how you're suddenly able to move around like a ballroom dancer when you've been the hobbler-cobbler for the past 5 years? I asked, making an intentional stab with my words to my friend to put him on edge and provoke his usual disdained melancholy out of him. It didn't work, however. I don't know how to explain it. I came to bed one night after kissing my son and putting him to sleep. I kissed my own wife and said goodnight, and then I went to sleep, Clive said. And you woke up the next morning able to walk normal, is that it? I chided. Yes, exactly. I can't explain it any other way, Clive stated, with a modesty and ease that was unusual to witness from him. Fine, I said, wanting to change the subject and talk about something with little to no mystery to it. I'm getting another round. No, I've got it, Christopher declared as he took his giant frame to the bar to order another round of Guinness for us all. Clive was a small-framed, short and sheepish man by appearance. He was immaculate in his work, but not someone you'd rely on for heavy lifting. Christopher, on the other hand, was the polar opposite, a burly, tall, and broad-shouldered lad who had been a star rugby player when we were in school form, and who made sure none of his friends ever went home scared of the bullies. He was a gentle giant, unless provoked, which rarely happened. Still, we must have seemed like a ragtag group of old chums sitting at this pub and talking about strange occurrences and mysteries of the indescribable kind and unexplainable kind. I didn't think any more about what they said and not said until I received a telegram a few weeks later from my mother down in Southamptonshire. She had taken ill, and the diagnosis from the family doctor looked bleak. Some common illness. Since common illness was my specialty, I figured that she just needed my special touch. I got on the train immediately and headed her way, but the prognosis was not anything in my wheelhouse or experience. The doctors couldn't explain, through simplistic or complicated medical and scientific understanding, what the cause of her malady was. There were no treatment options any of us could find. I stayed with her at her bedside through the end of the week, hoping for some indication of change or some sign of what to diagnose her with. There came nothing. She was awake and coherent enough to communicate and told me to return to London and only come back if I was sent for again. I didn't want to, but acquiesced her request. On the return back, as I sat on the train, I tried to think of what could be done. She was still so young, and prolonged life runs in our family. Both of my maternal grandparents were approaching their early 70s and were still going strong. My father had died when I was a wee lad, but my mother was not yet in her mid-50s. I realized that I needed a miracle. If that was the same thing as unexplainable luck or turnaround from misfortune to sudden healing, I recalled that fateful conversation at the pub with my chums a few weeks earlier. I stopped by Clive's shop on the way back to my flat to ask him about the source of his secret cure. He said he couldn't divulge any details, but gave me the secret address of a place that would provide assistance if I went in with an open mind. I agreed to do so, confessing and agreeing to leave my firmly held resignations about religion and concerns against the non-rational or non-logically explainable at the door. I felt desperate, enough to put my reputation as a professional physician on the line to speak and to seek the assistance of a potential soothsayer or mystic to aid my ailing mother in her time of crisis. And that is the end of chapter 2. And as I see that it's still just me, I'm going to entertain myself with this and anyone else who's listening to this replay. Again, if you want to hear or read this story for yourself and the digital ebook version, just message me and I'll send you a copy. I don't have it available for sale yet. When I do, I'll be sure to let you know. If you'd like to contribute to the stories that I write, you can purchase a copy of any of my other stories at growthfarming.com/products. With that, I'm going to continue on with the sharing of this story, and we'll get into some of the more metaphysical stuff with now the third chapter of this story. This is chapter 3 of A Place Within. I knocked on the door. There was no response. It was a cloudy and dreary day. The rains had slacked off, yet my umbrella seemed to only shield me from part of the ongoing downpour. As I stood in front of the oddly peculiar building, feeling nervous about what I was getting myself into, and feeling the wet pitter-patter of rain against my face, I decided to just go inside. I stepped into a small entryway that opened into a parlor. There was a lamp in the corner, which gave the only light in the room. There was a bar top with a ledger and pen on top, with a small wooden box next to it. There was a small piece of paper with scribbled instructions, which I could barely make out. It read, "Instructions. Write your request on the ledger. Place in the box. Believe. Trust. All good things come to ye who believes." So that was it. All that mystery my chums had been so tight-lipped on weeks ago about their sudden miraculous experiences must have come from their own happenings to this odd piece of directions in this strange parlor. Well, if it worked for them, it could work for me, I reasoned. But what was my request? That my mother recover from her mysterious illness? That she live a long, healthy, and happy life? This seemed noble. Yet a part of me also wanted something for myself as well. How could I make a request for my mother, and also for myself and my wants and dreams? I suddenly felt a bit embarrassed and ashamed for being so selfish. I had come here seeking a miracle for my dear beloved mother, the one person who'd given me life itself, and here I was trying to get something more for myself. I wasn't even sure I believed in all of this, but I must if I walked all the way over here from Northampton and was about to write something on this ledger and place it in this slot atop this strange box. Health. That was it. A long, happy and healthy life for Mother, and myself, and our whole family. There, that covered everyone, and not just a silly, selfish act. I wrote it as clearly as I could, tore the page from the ledger, folded it, and placed it in the box. What now, then? Do I return home and wait for word from this place? How will I know when this will happen? How will they know how to reach me? Fortunately, I had remembered to sign my full name on the paper, so I suppose they could look me up that way. Yet still there were so many uncertainties here. Who was going to be receiving my request? And who was going to be administering the answer or response to it? There was not another soul in this room, and very little furniture. It could hardly constitute an office, or barely even a waiting room. On the other side of the bar-sized table that I stood before, which held the scant instructions, the ledger, the submission box, was a thin, narrow door. The top of the door didn't go up to the top of the frame, leaving several centimeters of space available to see up and into the adjoining room. Being a relatively short fellow, I couldn't see into the gap at the top of the door. I thought of climbing up to the bar to stand and look through. As soon as I had that thought, this tiny creature flew right at me. It fluttered in front of my face at eye level, then rose up to hover in front of a large sign above the doorframe, which read, "Trust and believe. And that's the end of chapter 3. And I see my mom is with us. Hey, Mom, thanks for joining. I'm just going to go ahead and read. I've titled today's episode, Episode 4, A Place Within, Part 1, but I think I'm just going to go ahead and read the entirety of the story. So that way we've got it all in one place. And I'm going to continue on. This is Part 4, or Chapter 4 of A Place Within. It seems strange or peculiar that 2 weeks was such a consistent period of time in this tale, but 2 weeks to the day after my fateful trip to 7788 Dover Street, I gathered the lads to meet at the pub for our usual evening of pints and billiards. Only this time I had something special to share and some particular insights to glean from. When I told Christopher on the drive over that I understood partially what had led to the turnaround in his business, he said, "Oh, do you now, do you?" I just smiled, not wanting to give myself away. "Well, lads, it seems the good doctor has some news for us, as though he's experienced the inexplicable. I'm all ears to hear it. How about you lot?" Christopher said as he brought the first round of pints to our table from the bar, his large hands easily managing all 4 mugs without spilling a drop. "Yes, I too am eager to hear how things have gone since you came by my shop 1 fortnight ago, looking for a miraculous piece of help," Clive inserted before I could begin my tale. "All right, you shall hear it first from me. I spoke with my dear mother this week, and I have never seen her so full of life and zeal. It was as if she were 20 years younger and in the prime of her life. I almost didn't recognize her. I had traveled to her estate just to check on her and found this spry woman in her garden watering the daisies and talking to a hummingbird who was bouncing itself around her. To see my sweet mother out of bed and no longer knocking on disease's deadly door was shocking enough. But then I looked at the hummingbird, and it looked at me and flew over to me, flittering a few centimeters from my face and doing the strange dance-like flight for only a few moments, then flying off to go drink from the flowers around us. I realized it was the exact same hummingbird I had encountered when I went to Dover Street and made that unusual request. My request had been received, and now I stood in front of the living proof of it. I stated clearly. My friends didn't say a word in reply. Not at first. They just sat there and looked at me with bright smiles and cheery faces. I waited patiently for some kind of rebuttal, or even a question of some sort. Finally, Louis broke the silence. "So the hummingbird was how the divine speaks to you about miraculous transformations and the mysteries of the universe. Interesting," Louis said. It turns out that each of my friends had encountered a different animal or creature when each of them had gone into the drab parlor inside of 7788 Dover Street. Each creature they experienced had served a unique purpose for their individual life journey, and was a sign in and of itself for them to rise to a new level of being. They had each made their request in writing and placed it in the box, and then an animal or life form showed them something that would represent a piece of their own story to live out, unique to just them. We each get to live out the meaning of what we encounter there, even if we don't fully understand or know what it is at the time, Christopher said. I was curious what other animals and creatures were that my chums had encountered there. Christopher, being a Viking of a man, in size and strength, came into the parlor to find a large black bear asleep in the corner. He wondered if the bear was a squatter of this dilapidated building, or perhaps some form of security for the owners of the place. The bear woke up and raised itself to its feet gingerly, looked at him, and then looked at the bar top where the ledger and box were. Then it laid itself back down and seemed completely at ease. I think the bear represented the market, the way the industry seemed to be tightening and money drying up. I had been so afraid of losing everything that I wasn't operating from my ingenuity and skills. If I just did what I set out to do and believed in myself, The market would ease and not be an obstacle, Christopher said. When Clive had entered the parlor, he had seen a small dog. The dog was sitting in the same corner that the bear had been when Christopher entered. The dog did not bark or give any signs of apprehension upon seeing him. It just looked at him, then towards the bar top. It tried to stand up and walk towards him, but one of its hind legs didn't work. It seemed to be lame in one leg, and Clive immediately felt a deep empathy for it. After Clive wrote his request on the ledger, he paused and looked at the dog and wrote one more thing, then folded the paper and placed it in the box. Then I felt these two little paws press onto my hip. It was the dog wagging its tail, standing on its hind quarters, and licking my arm. It seemed so delighted, so full of life. Subsequently, I did too, Clive stated. Louis had an unusual experience, but of a seemingly different sort. He didn't find an animal in the corner. Instead, he saw a ghastly creature on top of the bar itself, right next to the ledger. He described it as a giant, brown, hairy spider, the size of Christopher's enormous Hans. Louis, being a man who seems more effeminate than masculine in nature, was distraught by this sight. He won't admit to having arachnophobia, but the signs seemed to indicate as much. Despite his alarm and nervousness, he cautiously grabbed the pen and jotted his request on the ledger, keeping his eye on the tarantula, a few mere centimeters away. He carefully tore the page from the ledger to not make any sudden movements, folded it, and placed it in the box. Then I looked towards it again, towards this ghastly spider, and it was not there. Vanished. And in its place was a bouquet of roses and lilies. They were radiant and beautiful and seemed to bring new light to the entire room. I had always felt that I myself was a ghastly creature, having been spurred by my beloved Carol for some time. But if I chose to change the way I saw myself, there's beauty inside me that deserves to be seen and recognized, Louis stated. And there it was, insights into the mysteries of the miraculous my friends had experienced that they had not made me privy to a fortnight before. But here as we sat enjoying our Guinness, it had all come full circle. I didn't understand the secrecy, nor did I understand why this mysterious Dover Street location was not something that had been reported by the citizens of London, or something that everyone had experienced. My chums told me that no one can go there unless someone tells them the address, and they have a pressing or terrible need that requires the universe to intervene itself, and only those who know of it from previous experience can disclose its location to another, and it must be done so with utmost discretion. This was them giving me the necessary instructions for what to do with my own new knowledge and experiences from this place. So, what do you think the hummingbird represents for you? Christopher asked. I didn't know, and it wouldn't be revealed to me for some time. My grandfather had concluded his story. When did you find out about the hummingbird and what it meant, grandfather? I asked as we sat on the beach and on the bench at St. James Square. We had wandered over here, and he began to recall the story he had just told me. It was the longest story he had ever told, and the most talking he had ever done with me. I was so hungry for more of his words, wisdom, and perspective, despite not fully understanding why at the time. I let him get to a stopping point before asking any more questions to appease my own extra-curious 10-year-old mind. It was today, I believe. Right now, grandfather replied. So, what is it? I inquired. I can't say. I saw that bookmark you have in that large book you brought with you today. Then we stumbled upon 7788 Dover Street. And it all came flooding back, grandfather replied. Part of me wanted to press him further, but I had a sudden distinct impression to let it go. We sat silently in the park for another few minutes before getting up to walk to the underground for me to go home. Grandfather never mentioned that experience again. He would recall his old chums, Louis, Clive, and Christopher, on occasion at family gatherings. I never met any of the gentlemen, but felt honored to know a special story about them that no one else knew. It was a story of mystic miracles and God and magic and wonder. Grandfather lived a long and healthy life, thriving as a doctor into his 80s before retiring and settling down to a life of leisure, gardening and reading. He maintained that devotion to practicality, yet still held space for the unseen mysteries to exist that didn't require explanation or evidence of proof. I maintained my childlike wonder and curiosity even into adulthood. Working in construction and renovation allows me to explore the myriad of possibilities and taking what some consider to be outdated or run down and repurposing it for new use and occupancy. I had recently been given a contract of a property close to Old St. James Square. It was said to be an old building that hadn't been occupied for decades. I was given the intersection and instructed to meet with a lady named Barbara. I walked to where I thought the building to be, but couldn't find it. All I saw was an empty lot. Perhaps it had been torn down and demolished, and the records had not yet been updated, I wondered. Alas, it didn't matter. This would make construction easier by starting from scratch from the ground up. But where was this lady that I was supposed to meet with? I looked around and didn't find anyone, not walking around, going from one place to the next. Was I in the right place after all? And with that, that's the end of Chapter 4. I'm going to continue. This is Part 5, Chapter 5. I will read this, and then I'll read the epilogue, and we will be... I'll open it up for anybody to share their thoughts or feelings or questions, if you have them. And I'm curious already if you can see the story beneath the story inside this tale. Because as in all stories, there's the surface level story of magic, mystical occurrences, miracles, the work of the divine, but there's also something else that's taking place inside the story, and I'm curious if you can see it already. We'll have a discussion about that in a few minutes, but first here is Part 5, the conclusion to A Place Within. I turned to walk down the next block, thinking I'd run into Barbara as I came around the corner. Instead, something different stopped me in my tracks. 7788 Dover Street. The sign above the door, the dilapidated facade, the dark black door with deep scratches on it, and the polished golden handle looked exactly as it had 25 years earlier. I had been curious about this place since that first afternoon walk with my grandfather and his incredible story. Several times in my teen adolescence, I had wandered over here looking for this place, searching for answers and thinking I needed a miracle to get me out of whatever pickle I believed I was in. It seemed daunting at the time, yet ended up being nothing of particular concern in the long run. But every time I looked for this place, it wasn't here. There had not been a building in this spot, and the dozen or so times I'd come here. Yet on this day, here it stood. Whether it was fate or random happenstance, I couldn't let this opportunity pass me by. I walked up and turned the golden door handle and stepped inside. The interior of this place looked nothing like what the exterior seemed to reveal. It was immaculate. There was chic furniture in its giant entryway, with a large ballroom directly in front. A massive crystal chandelier hung from the ceiling, with a humongous banquet table in the middle of the room. Along the black wall was an expansive stone fireplace with 2 lounge chairs, with a coffee table between them. Sitting in one of the chairs was an elegant, finely tuned, and finely dressed lady. She looked up at me and smiled as I came into this beautiful room. "Well, there you are," she said to me. Her voice was like an opera singer's, delivering a cadence and tone that was like an angel singing in perfect pitch. I paused for a moment, feeling a bit bewildered at the dazzling display of beauty and wonder all around me. "I've been waiting for you to arrive," she said to me. "Are you the lady I'm supposed to meet with today? Are you Bar?" I asked before she interrupted me. Yes. Sit down right here. We have much to discuss," she said empathetically. She said emphatically. I sat down in the lounge chair next to her as she poured a cup of tea from a pitcher on the coffee table, or a kettle. Yes, it was a tall kettle. It seemed to me like a pitcher. She lifted the cup and saucer to me. It was fine china, with little designs on them. I held the cup close to see what it was. The design resembled an artist's rendition of a bird, though I couldn't pick out the type. Where are we? I asked, almost without thinking, and instead allowing what was in my head to just come out of my mouth. Oh, we are in a very magical place. In many ways, this is where you've spent so much time. In other ways, it's a place that shows you who you are and what is possible for you, she sang with her unique talking-speaking style. My grandfather showed me this place years ago, but we only saw the outside. We never came in. What he told me about what was in here is vastly different from what I'm experiencing now. And how did you... I began to ask before she interrupted again. Only those chosen to enter may, and those who enter see a reflection of themselves and who or what they can become, if they will simply open their mind and heart to allow the divine to unfold within them, she replied. So all of this is a reflection of me and of my potential future? I asked with growing curiosity. Exactly. Everyone who is granted permission to enter is shown the contents of their thinking in some capacity, and they are given the gift of requesting a change to brighten their lives and the lives of those they love. No request is left unanswered, and now nothing that is asked for only benefits one person. Even a seemingly selfish request has a ripple effect into the lives of others because we are all interconnected. As one person is blessed, countless others are as well, she reported and replied with elegant grace. So why am I here? My life is very good. I have a happy and wonderful wife and family. My business is doing well. There aren't any tragedies or calamities I'm facing. I thought you only came here if you needed a miracle. I don't have a need for one right now, I replied. Does one only come to God when their life is falling apart? Or can you come into the divine's home and just have a spot of tea and a lovely conversation? Don't you know that the endless glory of the good, whom you call God, lives and operates within you? So, what you are doing now is seeing yourself and the infinite more closely, and having a wonderful opportunity to make a more profound request, she said with growing delight and cheerfulness. A request of what? I asked. What is the biggest, deepest desire of your heart? Go within yourself and find it. Go from glory to glory. You can have it all if you choose to allow yourself to. Abundance is yours, so ask for it. Don't be like so many others who only seek the divine and miracles when it seems that all hope is lost. It never is. You, my friend, have the capacity for so much more. So ask for it. It is yours. And this story concludes, as all of my others do, with not the end, but a new beginning. And here is the epilogue. This story probably surprised you in more than one way, didn't it? Yes, the story is a bit unconventional, and that's because it's my style of writing, my style of storytelling. At the same time, the style of how this story is presented is very different than the norm. I like breaking rules, particularly when it comes to formatting, and you're not looking at the formatting as you're listening to this, but I'm obviously seeing the formatting as I'm reading it in the digital version. So if you want to see the formatting, and I've told this story in a very different sort of way formatically, send me a message and I'll make sure that I can send you a copy of this and you can have the experience for yourself. All of us have written and read books that have the same formatting rules for centuries. And so what I decided to do in the formatting of the way that this book is typed out, or the typeface of it, the font style, if you will, is I broke the rules. Because each of the characters have their own unique personality, and when you read this story, you'll see that there's a different typeface for each of the characters inside the story. The story begins with Douglas as a boy narrating everything, and it concludes with him narrating as well, but he is narrating it as an adult. So that the typeface or the font type is Georgia, if you're familiar with that. Bernard, the grandfather, when he took over the narration, the narrative portions are slightly in a different typeface. And each of the characters' typeface is a reflection of their personality and the presence that's described inside the narrative. Because I wanted each character to be fully represented in their own voice, distinct from everyone and everything else. And as I read this, I tried to give each character their own voice and their own British accent. Now, obviously, I'm not British, so I did the best I could do with my my voice acting skills. This is because if you're watching this story on screen, which, by the way, I write all of my stories as though it's a movie or a TV show that I'm watching, because that's the way that the story comes to me. If you're watching the story on screen, each character has their own presence, their own voice, and each actor or actress personifying them exemplifies this. So embodying this in the formatting of this little mini novel is exactly how I wrote it by hand in the journal that it originated in, which, by the way, I write a lot of my stories in journal form by pen and paper, and then I transcribe it over and type it up into digital format. And in this presentation, I did my best to replicate that experience for you, for your listening enjoyment. And I'm curious what you think. Now, aside from the formatting, there are some other interesting things to point out. If you put yourself in the protagonist's shoes for a moment now, and think of what you would do in that last chapter, you now given the opportunity to go to the divine, to ask for anything that you want, what would you ask for? Clearly, this story is about the power of faith. That's the story beneath the story. It's also about the power of prayer. And it's about something else too. Something that's not that far away from us, but actually comes from our own place within. Neville Goddard is one of my all-time favorite teachers, and he helped me understand faith in a way that religion really never did, to be honest. Growing up in a staunchly Baptist household, there were many things about God and the Bible that confused me. Faith seemed to be something that involved believing in the unseen and hoping that it would come true or that it was true. And when I was young, I put my faith in an invisible deity that existed in some other realm, hoping that I was good enough to get in his good graces and be permitted to receive what I asked for. And I figured that my faith wasn't very strong because it didn't seem like I received a lot of what I asked for very often. However, understanding faith from a different framing, or looking through a resplendent window and changing the definition of it, as Neville articulated, puts all of this into perspective. This is what Neville taught me about faith. He said that, quote, faith is unwavering loyalty to the unseen reality within, end quote. Now, the key here is both the high degree of loyalty and the dedication to the unseen reality within. We're capable of accessing the divine internally, in our hearts and in our imaginations. This is the realm where all things are possible, the kingdom of heaven. In the story that you just heard, every character experiences various degrees of struggle, loss, and almost failure. Everyone except for Douglas. When given the chance to ask for anything, Bernard and his friends all seek the answer to their impending trial and are redeemed. But notice their perspective, or their state of consciousness. This is what the majority of people do with their prayers. They focus on the problems and what isn't going well. It's more of a supplication and a begging for mercy than anything else, which is also a very human thing. I've made countless begging, pleading, desperation prayers in my lifetime. Some have been answered, many of them have not. Instead of looking at God from the perspective of someone who sits in a cloud and answers pleas for help all day, we're given a different perspective through this story. The mystical building of 7788 Dover Street is a place that's not actually on a map. It's a portal into a dimension that doesn't exist, similar to something that you might read in a Stephen King book. Except here, the portal goes to a more heavenly place that reflects the inner world of the person who enters it than some realm in hell, like you might interpret from such stories as 1408, which is a great Stephen King book if you're curious. And the animals that each character encountered were metaphoric pictures of how they saw themselves. Clive saw the dog with a gimp leg who was kind and sweet. Christopher saw the large bear who seemed intimidating but was actually harmless and non-threatening. Louis saw the giant tarantula, which was scary at first glance, but then morphed into something beautiful. And Bernard saw the hummingbird, which revealed how fleeting fear can be, as well as how much hope exists when you allow it to float in. Speaking of hope, I do highly recommend another of my mini novels that will shift your perspective on life and what's possible through a murder mystery tale. It's a story called Hope Flows, and it's available for sale in both the digital ebook and the audiobook version bundled together at growthfarming.com/products. You can read and listen to that story and read the epilogue to see if you guessed what was really going on the entire time. The story behind the story, much like what this story exhibited for you. Now, I asked a question at the beginning of this epilogue. What would you do if you were in Douglas's shoes? Now that you've heard the grandfather's tale and you know what's possible when you enter 7788 Dover Street, what do you ask for? Or what would you ask for? Do you ask for one thing, more than one thing, something for yourself or something for another? It's worth thinking about, because 7788 Dover Street is already inside of you. It's a place within you. That divine connection is in your imagination. So how will you use it? That's the question I'm going to leave for you to ponder and to think about. That's also going to be the question I'm going to leave for you for the end of this episode of The Resplendent Window. Appreciate everyone for joining me in any capacity, whether you heard a part of this story or the whole thing. Thank you for spending part of your day with me. For those listening to the replay, this show airs live on LinkedIn on Mondays at 4 p.m. Central Time. If you're on LinkedIn, come find me. If you're not following me, follow me there. And otherwise, catch up on any of the stories that I have shared through the Resplendent Window Radio Show, including this one. If you want a copy of this story, I'm willing to give it to you for free, so you can have this experience and tap into your imagination and go into a story behind the story, a story beneath the story, which is what so much of my storytelling is about. Send me a message. My email is dgrant@dgrantsmith.com, and I'll make sure you get a copy of the story. Appreciate you. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll see you next time.